Mountain air sharp and clean filled 12-year-old Jake's lungs as he hiked the ridge trail with Rex, his loyal German shepherd, padding beside him. Life had been hard since his father passed, leaving Jake and his mother alone in their small cabin. Jake escaped to these peaks where the silence felt less heavy. Rex stopped suddenly, his ears pricked forward, and began pawing at something half buried in the rocky soil. Jake knelt beside him, brushing away dirt and moss to reveal a massive stone unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was perfectly round, almost too smooth, with strange markings etched across its surface that shimmered in the sunlight. Something deep in his gut whispered this was no ordinary rock, that inside it lay something extraordinary. But what secret could be hidden within a stone buried for so long? Would Jake have the courage to cut it open? What would he find inside? Jake ran his fingers along the surface of the stone, tracing the mysterious markings that seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't explain. They weren't random scratches or natural formations, but deliberate symbols, carefully etched by human hands, perhaps decades or even centuries ago. Rex circled the discovery, his tail wagging with an excitement that mirrored Jake's own racing heartbeat. The boy tried to lift the stone, grunting with effort as his thin arms strained against its weight. It was far heavier than it looked, as if something dense and precious lay hidden within its rocky shell. Jake sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool mountain breeze, and studied the problem before him. He couldn't leave it here, not now that he'd found it. Not when every instinct screamed that this stone held answers to questions he didn't even know he was asking. His father had taught him to trust his gut, to listen to that quiet voice that spoke louder than logic or fear. Jake made his decision. He removed his worn flannel shirt, laying it flat on the ground beside the stone, then carefully rolled the heavy object onto the fabric. Using the shirt as a makeshift sling, he began the slow, arduous journey down the mountain trail. Rex seemed to understand the importance of their find, staying close to Jake's side, occasionally nudging the boy's leg as if offering encouragement. Every 50 feet, Jake had to stop and rest, his arms burning, his back aching from the awkward weight. The trail that normally took him 20 minutes to descend stretched into an hour-long ordeal. Twice the stone nearly slipped from his grasp on steep sections, and once Rex grabbed the edge of the shirt in his teeth, helping to steady the load when Jake stumbled over a root. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when they finally reached the small clearing where the cabin stood. Jake's mother's old truck was gone from its usual spot beside the woodpile, which meant she was still in town working her shift at the diner. She wouldn't be home for at least 3 more hours, giving Jake time to examine his discovery without having to explain why he'd hauled a massive rock down from the ridge. He dragged the stone around to the back of the cabin where his father's old workshop stood, a small shed that Jake's mother could barely bring herself to enter anymore. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon light that streamed through the single window. His father's tools still hung on their pegboard, exactly where he'd left them 18 months ago, before the accident that had changed everything. Jake carefully positioned the stone on the workbench, then stepped back to really look at it. In the dimmer light of the workshop, the markings seemed even more pronounced, casting tiny shadows that revealed their depth and precision. He pulled his father's old magnifying glass from a drawer and leaned in close. The symbols weren't random at all, but formed a pattern, almost like a map or a code, circling the stone's equator in a deliberate sequence. Rex sat by the door, his amber eyes fixed on the stone with an intensity that made Jake wonder if his dog could sense something he couldn't, some vibration or scent that revealed the stone's true nature. Jake spent the next hour examining every inch of the stone's surface, his fingers tracing each symbol with the careful attention his father had taught him when they used to explore the mountains together. The markings were unlike anything he'd seen in his geography books at school or in the old maps that lined the walls of the town library. Some symbols resembled ancient pictographs, while others looked almost mathematical, precise angles and curves that suggested meaning beyond mere decoration. He copied them carefully into an old notebook, his pencil scratching across the page as he tried to capture every detail. Rex remained at his post by the door, occasionally rising to pace in a small circle before settling again, his eyes never leaving the stone for more than a few seconds. The dog's behavior was unusual, even for Rex, who was normally calm and patient during Jake's mountain explorations. A low whine escaped the German shepherd's throat, barely audible but insistent, as if he was trying to communicate something urgent that Jake couldn't quite understand. The boy set down his notebook and walked over to his father's tool chest, a heavy wooden box that had survived 3 generations of mountain living. Inside, organized with the precision of a man who respected his craft, lay an array of tools, hammers and chisels, files and rasps, measuring instruments and marking gauges. Jake selected a small geology hammer and a narrow chisel, tools his father had used when collecting mineral samples from the mountain streams. He returned to the workbench and held the stone steady with one hand while examining it from different angles in the fading afternoon light. There, on what he'd arbitrarily decided was the stone's lower hemisphere, he noticed a hairline crack, so fine it was almost invisible, running for about 2 inches along the surface. It appeared to be a natural flaw in the rock, a weak point where the internal structure had separated slightly over time. Jake positioned the chisel's edge carefully along the crack, taking a deep breath to steady his hands. His heart hammered in his chest as he raised the small hammer, hesitating for just a moment as doubt crept into his mind. What if he was about to destroy something precious, something that should remain intact? But that voice in his gut, the same instinct that had compelled him to bring the stone home, urged him forward. He brought the hammer down in a controlled tap, the metallic ring echoing in the small workshop. A tiny fragment of stone flaked away, revealing a slightly different texture beneath. Jake continued with patient, careful strikes, each one calculated to follow the natural weakness in the stone's structure rather than forcing a break that might damage whatever lay inside. Rex stood now, his body tense, and moved closer to the workbench. Another whine escaped him, higher pitched this time, and his tail remained still rather than wagging. The dog's front paws lifted slightly off the ground in an almost imperceptible dance of anxiety or anticipation. Jake paused in his work, looking at his companion with concern. "What is it, boy? What do you sense?" Rex's only response was to fix his intelligent amber eyes on the growing crack in the stone's surface, where Jake's careful work had now opened a gap nearly a 1/4 inch wide. The boy could see darkness inside, a hollow space that confirmed his suspicion that this was no ordinary rock but some kind of container, fashioned by human hands to hold something precious or secret. He returned to his task with renewed determination, the chips of stone falling away like scales, revealing more of the mystery beneath. The workshop grew darker as the sun dropped behind the western peaks, but Jake was too absorbed in his work to stop and light the old kerosene lamp that hung from a beam overhead. His hands moved with increasing confidence, guided by feel as much as sight, following the natural lines of fracture that suggested the stone had been designed to be opened, though only by someone patient and careful enough to find its hidden weakness. Darkness had fully claimed the workshop when Jake finally felt the stone give way beneath his careful ministrations, splitting along the widening crack with a sound like a long-held breath being released. Rex barked once, sharp and urgent, breaking the silence that had settled over them like a blanket. Jake's hands trembled as he set down his tools and reached for the kerosene lamp, his fingers fumbling with the matches in his eagerness and anxiety. The warm glow of lamplight filled the small space, casting dancing shadows across the walls where his father's tools hung like silent witnesses to this moment of revelation. Jake carefully pried the 2 halves of the stone apart, his breath catching in his throat as the hollow interior was revealed. Nestled within the rocky shell, protected from the elements and the passage of time, was a leather pouch, its surface cracked and weathered but still intact, darkened to a deep brown that spoke of considerable age. The pouch was wrapped with a leather cord, knotted multiple times as if whoever had sealed it wanted to ensure its contents remained secure. Jake's fingers worked at the knots, which had tightened over the years, becoming stubborn and resistant. Rex pressed against his leg, the dog's warmth a comfort as Jake finally freed the last knot and opened the pouch. The smell of old paper and leather filled his nostrils, a scent that reminded him of the used bookstore in town where he sometimes spent his allowance. He carefully emptied the pouch's contents onto the workbench, his eyes widening as each item emerged. First came several sheets of paper, yellowed with age and covered in typed text that was faded but still legible. They appeared to be official documents of some kind, with letterheads and stamps that suggested legal or governmental origins. Next was a photograph, its edges curled and its surface marked by the fingerprints of whoever had handled it last. The image showed a man standing in front of a building Jake didn't recognize, his face serious, his posture suggesting confidence or perhaps defiance. Jake studied the stranger's features, searching for some connection, some reason why this photograph would be hidden in a stone on the mountain, but the man's identity remained a mystery. Then came a map, hand-drawn with remarkable detail, showing the mountain ranges Jake knew so well, the valleys and ridges and streams that formed the landscape of his entire world. But this map contained markings he'd never seen on any official survey, specific locations circled in red ink, with notes written in small, precise handwriting along the margins. Jake's heart began to race as he recognized some of the landmarks, places he'd hiked with his father, spots where they'd stopped to rest or to admire the view. The map suggested these locations held significance beyond their natural beauty, that they were pieces of a larger puzzle waiting to be solved. The final item in the pouch made Jake's hands go numb, his vision blurring with sudden tears that he blinked away furiously. It was a journal, small enough to fit in a jacket pocket, bound in worn leather that had once been a rich brown but had faded to a mottled gray. He knew this journal, had seen his father writing in it on their hikes, watching as his dad would pause to jot down observations about wildlife or weather patterns or the health of the forest. Jake had always assumed those notes were simple records, a naturalist's diary of mountain life. But as he opened the journal now, his father's familiar handwriting filling page after page, he realized these entries held far more weight than casual observations. The dates began nearly 2 years ago, months before his father's death, and the early entries seemed normal enough, discussing trail conditions and animal sightings. But as Jake flipped forward, the tone changed dramatically, the words becoming urgent, almost frantic at times. Phrases leaped out at him. Saw them again today. Can't let them continue. Evidence is mounting. They're watching the house now. Jake pulled the lamp closer, his hands shaking as he turned to the first page of the journal, reading his father's words with an intensity that made his eyes burn. The early entries were dated from 2 springs ago, back when life still felt normal, when his father would return from his forest ranger duties with stories about deer tracks and eagle nests. But even in those initial pages, Jake detected an undercurrent of concern, brief mentions of unusual activity in the restricted zones of the mountain, tire tracks where no vehicles should have been, fresh disturbances in areas that were supposed to remain untouched. His father had begun documenting these irregularities with the methodical precision of a man trained to observe and record, noting dates, times, locations, and weather conditions. As Jake read deeper into the journal, the entries grew more specific and more troubling. His father had discovered something he called the old mining claim, a reference to abandoned workings from the 19th century that should have been sealed and forgotten decades ago. But according to the journal, someone had reopened access to these sites, not for historical preservation but for purposes his father was still trying to understand. The name Henderson appeared repeatedly, always accompanied by questions and concerns. Thomas Henderson, Jake remembered, was the wealthy businessman who owned the big house on the hill, overlooking town, a man his mother had always told him to respect and never trouble. His father's entries painted a different picture entirely, describing Henderson as a man who operated in shadows, who used his money and influence to avoid scrutiny, who had powerful friends in the county government and the state capital. Jake's father had begun to piece together a pattern, connecting Henderson's business interests with the mysterious activity in the mountains, with environmental reports that disappeared before they could be filed, with inspectors who found nothing wrong in places where problems were obvious to anyone with eyes to see. The phrase "they're watching" appeared first in an entry from 14 months ago, a simple statement without elaboration that nonetheless sent chills down Jake's spine as he read it in the lamplight. His father had noticed surveillance, vehicles that followed him on his ranger patrols, figures in the forest who disappeared when approached, phone calls where no one spoke but he could hear breathing on the other end. The entries became shorter after that, more cryptic, as if his father had grown afraid that the journal itself might be discovered and read by the wrong eyes. He began using abbreviations and codes, references to locations by nickname rather than proper designation, initials instead of full names. But the message was clear to Jake, who had spent countless hours hiking these mountains with his father, who knew every trail and landmark intimately. His father had been conducting an investigation, gathering evidence of something illegal and dangerous, something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Jake flipped through the pages with growing urgency, watching the dates march forward toward the terrible day that had ended everything. The entries grew more sparse but more urgent. Brief statements about collecting samples, photographing evidence, recording conversations, building the case. His father had been planning to expose Henderson, to bring his findings to authorities who couldn't be bought or intimidated, to protect the mountain that had been his life's work and his family's home. Then Jake reached the final entry, dated exactly 7 days before his father's supposed accident, and the words blurred as tears finally spilled down his cheeks. The handwriting was rushed, almost frantic, so unlike his father's usual careful script that Jake could feel the fear and determination radiating from the page. "I've hidden the proof," his father had written, multiple locations marked on the map. "If anything happens to me, if they succeed in silencing me, Jake will find it when he's ready. He knows these mountains better than anyone. He has my eyes, my instincts. The stone will call to him when the time is right. Trust Rex to guide you, son." Finish what I started. Jake set the journal down, his whole body shaking as the implications crashed over him like a wave. Jake sat frozen at the workbench, his father's journal still open to that final devastating entry, when he heard the familiar rumble of his mother's truck coming up the dirt road that led to their cabin. He hadn't noticed how much time had passed, hadn't heard the distant church bells in town marking 9 o'clock, hadn't registered that Rex had moved from his watchful position to stand at the workshop door, ears alert to the approaching vehicle. Panic flooded through Jake's body as he considered hiding the evidence, stuffing everything back into the leather pouch and concealing it somewhere his mother wouldn't find it. But something stopped him, perhaps the weight of his father's words still echoing in his mind, perhaps the understanding that secrets had already cost their family too much. He heard the truck door slam, heard his mother's weary footsteps crossing the yard, heard her call his name with the slight edge of worry that crept into her voice whenever she came home to find the cabin dark. Rex whined softly and looked back at Jake, as if asking permission to go greet her, but the boy remained still, watching the doorway of the workshop. His mother appeared there moments later, her face lined with exhaustion from a long shift serving coffee and pie to tourists and locals alike, her uniform still smelling of fryer grease and dish soap. She saw the lamplight first, then Jake sitting at his father's workbench, and her expression shifted from relief to confusion to recognition, as her eyes fell on the journal lying open beside the broken stone. The color drained from her face so completely that Jake thought she might faint, and he jumped up from his stool just as her hand reached out to steady herself against the doorframe. "Where did you find that?" Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and raw as if the words were being torn from somewhere deep inside her. Jake gestured helplessly at the stone, at the leather pouch, at the documents and maps spread across the workbench like evidence at a crime scene. "On the mountain. Rex found it buried on the ridge trail. Mom, I had to open it. I had to know what was inside." She moved into the workshop like a woman walking through a nightmare, her steps slow and uncertain, her hand trailing along the wall as if she needed its support to remain upright. When she reached the workbench and saw the journal's open pages, saw her husband's handwriting preserved there like a voice from beyond the grave, something inside her broke. She collapsed onto the old wooden chair in the corner, the one Jake's father had sat in while repairing equipment or sharpening tools, and buried her face in her hands. The sound of her crying filled the small space, broken sobs that shook her entire body, grief that had been held back for 18 months finally finding release. Jake stood helpless, wanting to comfort her but not knowing how, his own tears streaming down his face as he watched his mother fall apart. Rex moved to her side, pressing his warm bulk against her legs, offering the silent comfort that had been his gift since the day Jake's father had brought him home as a puppy. Minutes passed before she could speak, before she could lift her face and look at her son with eyes that held such pain and fear that Jake almost wished he'd never found the stone at all. "It wasn't an accident," she said finally, each word deliberate and heavy. "Your father's death. I've known since the day it happened, but I had no proof, no one who would believe me, and I had you to protect. I told myself that if I stayed quiet, if I didn't ask questions or make trouble, they would leave us alone. They would let us grieve in peace and move on." She reached for the journal, her fingers trembling as they touched the leather cover, and Jake saw her read that final entry. Saw her face crumple again with fresh grief. He was investigating Henderson Mining Company, their illegal operations in the mountains. They're dumping toxic waste in the old mine shafts, poisoning the watershed that feeds the entire valley. Your father collected evidence, water samples that showed contamination, photographs of their trucks dumping barrels where they thought no one could see. He was going to expose them, to bring in federal investigators who couldn't be bought. Her voice grew stronger now, anger mixing with the grief, and she looked at Jake with a fierce intensity. 3 days before he died, men came to our door, professional men in expensive suits. They offered him money to stop asking questions, to destroy his evidence and forget what he'd seen. When he refused, they threatened us, threatened you specifically. Said accidents happen in the mountains all the time. The children playing near old mine shafts sometimes don't come home. Your father told them he'd kill anyone who came near you, and they left. 4 days later, he was dead, his body found at the base of Widow's Peak with a broken climbing rope that your father would never have trusted. Not in a million years. She stood and gripped Jake's shoulders, her fingers digging into his flesh with desperate strength. Jake, listen to me. You have to leave this alone. Forget the journal, forget whatever else your father hid. These are dangerous men with unlimited resources and no conscience. I can't lose you too. I won't survive it. Please, promise me you'll let this go. Jake lay in his bed that night, staring at the ceiling of his small room where shadows from the moonlight filtered through the pine trees outside his window, creating shifting patterns that reminded him of the symbols etched on the stone. His mother had begged him to promise he would forget everything, to let his father's investigation die with him, and he had nodded, unable to form the words that would be an outright lie, but equally unable to commit to a promise he knew he couldn't keep. She had taken the journal from the workshop, clutching it to her chest like a lifeline, and retreated to her bedroom where he could hear her quiet sobbing through the thin walls of the cabin. Jake had waited until her crying subsided into the silence of exhausted sleep before returning to the workshop to gather the documents, the photograph, and the map, wrapping them carefully in an old oilcloth he found in his father's tool chest. Rex had followed him back to his room, the German shepherd's presence a comfort in the darkness that now felt oppressive rather than peaceful. The dog had settled on the braided rug beside Jake's bed, but his ears remained alert, swiveling at every sound from the forest, every creak of the cabin's aging timbers. Sleep proved impossible for Jake, his mind replaying his mother's words, seeing the fear in her eyes, understanding for the first time the true weight of what his father had been fighting against. But beneath the fear was something else, a spark of anger that grew brighter with each passing hour. His father had died trying to protect this mountain, trying to stop powerful men from poisoning the land that sustained their entire community, and Jake was supposed to simply forget that sacrifice, to let those same men continue their destruction without consequence. The injustice of it burned in his chest, hot and insistent, warring with his desire to keep his mother safe and honor her desperate plea. It was close to midnight when Rex's behavior changed, his body going rigid, a low growl rumbling from deep in his chest. Jake sat up immediately, his heart hammering, and moved to the window where Rex now stood with his front paws on the sill, his lips pulled back from his teeth in a silent snarl. At first, Jake saw nothing unusual, just the familiar landscape of their small clearing bathed in silver moonlight, the workshop standing dark and silent, the trees forming a black wall at the property's edge. Then headlights appeared on the dirt road that wound past their cabin, moving slowly, too slowly for someone simply driving home. The vehicle came to a stop about 50 yards from their property line, positioned where the trees thinned enough to provide a clear view of the cabin, but far enough away to seem coincidental to anyone who might notice. Jake's blood ran cold as he recognized the shape of a large black SUV, its windows tinted dark, its chrome gleaming in the moonlight. He had seen that vehicle before, he realized now, his mind flashing back to his hike on the ridge trail earlier that day. It had been parked at the trailhead when he and Rex had started their climb, and he remembered thinking it seemed out of place, too expensive and clean for the rough mountain roads that led there. At the time, he had dismissed it as a tourist's rental, someone from the city who didn't know better than to bring such a vehicle into wilderness country. But now, seeing it parked in the darkness outside his home, he understood it had been following him, watching him, waiting to see where he would go and what he would find. Rex's growl grew louder, and Jake placed a hand on the dog's head, feeling the tension in every muscle, the barely restrained instinct to protect his pack. "Quiet, boy," Jake whispered, afraid that any sound might draw attention to his window, might reveal that he was awake and aware of their observer. The SUV's engine remained running, a faint purr that Jake could hear in the stillness of the mountain night, and he could see the glow of a cigarette or perhaps a phone screen behind the darkened windshield. Someone was sitting there, watching their cabin, sending a message that was clear even without words. "We know where you live. We know you're alone. We're watching." Jake backed away from the window, his mind racing through possibilities and dangers. If they knew about the stone, if they had been watching him on the mountain, then they knew he had found whatever his father had hidden. His mother's fears weren't paranoia but justified terror based on real threats from real men who had already killed once to protect their secrets. He moved quickly now, dropping to his knees beside his bed and working his fingers along the edge of the floorboards where his father had once shown him a loose section, a hiding place used by the cabin's original builders during an era when people routinely concealed valuables from thieves and tax collectors. The board came up with a soft creak, revealing a shallow space between the floor joists, and Jake carefully placed the oilcloth bundle containing the documents, photograph, and map into the darkness below. He replaced the board, then dragged his rug over the spot, arranging it carefully to look undisturbed. The journal remained with his mother, but at least the physical evidence his father had died protecting was now hidden somewhere these men wouldn't easily find it. When he returned to the window, the SUV was still there, its presence a malevolent weight pressing against the fragile safety of their home. Morning came too slowly and too quickly at once, the sun rising over the eastern peaks to reveal the dirt road empty, the black SUV having vanished sometime before dawn, leaving only tire tracks in the soft earth as evidence of its vigil. Jake had barely slept, dozing fitfully while Rex maintained his watch by the window, and when his mother called him for breakfast, her eyes were red and swollen, her movements mechanical as she set a plate of eggs and toast before him that neither of them had the appetite to eat. She said nothing about the journal, nothing about their conversation in the workshop, but her silence was heavy with unspoken warnings and fears. Jake knew she wanted him to act as if yesterday had never happened, to return to the simple routines of their grief-stricken but predictable life, to be a child again instead of the inheritor of his father's dangerous legacy. He nodded when she reminded him to catch the school bus, nodded when she told him she loved him, nodded when she said she would be working a double shift and wouldn't be home until late. But as he walked down the dirt road with Rex trotting beside him, his backpack lighter than usual because he'd barely remembered to stuff his textbooks inside, Jake's mind was already planning how he would spend his day. The yellow school bus arrived with its usual groan of brakes and cloud of dust, and Jake climbed aboard, ignoring the chatter of his classmates, their concerns about homework and weekend plans seeming trivial and distant compared to the weight he now carried. The 40-minute ride into town passed in a blur of forest and farmland, his forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window, watching the mountain recede behind him. At school, Jake moved through his morning classes like a ghost, his teachers' voices washing over him without comprehension, his worksheets remaining blank on his desk. When lunch period finally arrived, he skipped the cafeteria entirely and headed straight for the school library, a small room that smelled of old books and floor polish, presided over by Mrs. Chen, the elderly librarian who had helped Jake's father research local history for his ranger duties. She looked up from her desk as Jake entered, her expression softening with sympathy as it always did when she saw him, the poor boy who'd lost his father. The child everyone in town treated with careful kindness that somehow made the loss feel more permanent. Jake approached her desk with a determination that seemed to surprise her. "Mrs. Chen, I need to use the computer to research something for a school project." The lie came easily. Perhaps too easily, and he saw a flicker of something in her eyes that suggested she didn't entirely believe him. But she nodded and gestured toward the row of ancient desktop computers along the far wall. Jake chose the one in the corner, away from the few other students who had wandered in during lunch, and began his search. He typed Henderson Mining Company into the search engine and watched as pages of results loaded, most of them official corporate information about mining operations throughout the western states. Financial reports, and press releases about community investments and environmental stewardship. The public face of Henderson's empire was polished and pristine, full of photographs showing smiling workers and reclaimed land, testimonials from local officials praising the company's commitment to responsible resource extraction. But Jake dug deeper, adding terms like violations, complaints, and environmental impact to his searches, and slowly a different picture began to emerge. Buried in the archives of regional newspapers and environmental advocacy websites were reports of contaminated water supplies near Henderson operations in 3 different states, lawsuits that had been settled quietly out of court with non-disclosure agreements, whistleblowers who had come forward only to recant their statements weeks later. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to look closely. Henderson Mining operated with impunity, using money and legal pressure to silence critics and avoid accountability. Jake found several references to Thomas Henderson himself, a man in his early 60s who had inherited his father's mining business and expanded it into a multi-state operation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Photographs showed a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and expensive suits, shaking hands with governors and senators, cutting ribbons at charity events, the very picture of respectable wealth. But in one older article from 5 years ago, Jake found a photograph that made his heart stop. His father, standing at a microphone during what the caption identified as a town meeting, his face set with determination, while Thomas Henderson sat in the front row, his expression cold and hostile. The article's headline read, "Local Ranger Questions Mining Company's Environmental Practices," and the text described how Jake's father had presented concerns about water quality testing near old mining sites that Henderson's company had purchased for potential reopening. Henderson's response, quoted in the article, dismissed the concerns as unfounded fears from someone who doesn't understand modern mining technology. The article concluded by noting that subsequent environmental reports had found no issues with water quality, though Jake noticed the reports themselves were never published or made available for public review, their findings summarized only in brief statements from county officials. He printed the article, then searched for more recent environmental reports related to their mountain region, finding only a frustrating void where public records should have been. Documents that were listed in indexes but unavailable for download, marked as pending review or temporarily restricted for administrative purposes. Jake got off the school bus at the stop before his usual one, telling the driver he was visiting a friend, which was technically true even if his intentions went far deeper than a casual social call. Rex was waiting for him at the tree line where Jake had left him that morning, the German shepherd emerging from the shadows with his tail wagging, and together they set off on the trail that led deeper into the mountains, away from the main road and the scattered houses that marked the edge of town. The afternoon sun filtered through the towering pines, creating columns of golden light that would have been beautiful if Jake's mind hadn't been consumed with the weight of what he'd learned at the library and the dangerous knowledge hidden beneath his bedroom floor. He walked for nearly an hour, following a path that only locals knew, one that his father had shown him years ago when they would visit old Pete for advice on wildlife management or simply to share stories around a campfire. Pete Mackenzie had been a forest ranger for 40 years before arthritis, and age had forced him into retirement, and he had been his father's mentor, the man who had taught him to read the mountains the way other people read books. Pete's cabin sat in a clearing carved from the wilderness decades ago, a solid structure of hand-hewn logs that had weathered countless storms and winters, smoke rising from its stone chimney even on this mild autumn afternoon. The old man was sitting on his porch when Jake and Rex emerged from the tree line, his weathered face breaking into a smile that faded quickly when he saw the expression on the boy's face. Pete was in his 70s now, his hair white as fresh snow, his body bent but still strong, his eyes the clear blue of high mountain lakes. He wore the same style of clothes Jake's father had favored, flannel shirt, canvas pants, worn boots that had walked thousands of miles of wilderness trails. "Jake Callahan," Pete said, rising from his rocking chair with a slight grimace that spoke of old bones and older injuries. "Wasn't expecting you today. Your mama know you're up here." Jake shook his head, suddenly uncertain how to begin, how to explain why he'd come or what he needed to know. But Pete seemed to read something in his silence, in the tension of his posture, and his expression grew serious. "Come inside, boy. Looks like we need to talk." The interior of Pete's cabin was exactly as Jake remembered, simple, functional, lined with shelves holding books about forestry and wildlife. Maps covering every available wall space, a fire crackling in the stone hearth that Pete had built with his own hands. The old man poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that sat permanently on his wood stove, handing one to Jake even though he was only 12, a gesture that acknowledged the adult conversation they were about to have. Jake reached into his backpack and pulled out the hand-drawn map he'd found in the stone, the one his father had marked with red circles and cryptic notes. He spread it across Pete's kitchen table, smoothing the creases with trembling hands. Pete moved closer, adjusting his reading glasses, and as his eyes focused on the map, Jake watched the color drain from the old man's face like water from a broken cup. Pete's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles going white, and he let out a long, shaky breath that seemed to carry the weight of terrible knowledge. "Where did you get this?" His voice was barely above a whisper, rough with emotion that might have been fear or anger or both. "I found it hidden on the mountain," Jake said. "In a stone my father left for me. There was a journal, too, and documents. He was investigating something before he died. Something about Henderson Mining Company. Pete sank into a chair as if his legs could no longer support him, and for a long moment he simply stared at the map, his finger tracing the marked locations with the familiarity of someone who knew every inch of this territory. "Your father was a brave man," Pete said finally. "Braver than me, God help me. He saw what I saw but had the courage to do something about it." He looked up at Jake, his eyes wet with unshed tears. "These locations, the ones your father marked, they're old mine shafts from the 1882nd, part of the original Henderson claim that's been in that family for generations. They were sealed in the 1922nd after several collapses killed miners, and they've been officially closed ever since. But about 3 years ago, I started noticing activity up there, trucks going in and out on old logging roads that nobody uses anymore. I reported it through proper channels, but my concerns were dismissed. Said I was seeing things, that my age was making me paranoid." Pete's voice grew harder, bitter with the memory of being ignored and patronized. "Then your father started investigating independently, doing what I should have done, collecting evidence instead of just filing reports that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. Those mine shafts, Jake, they're being used as dump sites for toxic waste. Henderson's company has operations all over the region, and instead of properly disposing of their contaminated materials, chemicals and heavy metals and God knows what else, they're trucking it up here under cover of darkness and dumping it into those old shafts. The waste seeps down through the rock into the underground aquifer that feeds every stream, every well, every water source for 50 miles. They're poisoning the entire watershed, killing the mountain from the inside out, and they're getting away with it because they own the right people, because inspections get canceled or reports get lost, because anyone who asks too many questions ends up silenced." Rex whined softly, pressing against Jake's leg as if sensing the enormity of what Pete was revealing, and Jake felt his hands clench into fists, his father's final journal entry echoing in his mind. Pete rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains that had been his life's work, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that reminded Jake painfully of his father. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths and dangerous memories, broken only by the crackling of the fire and Rex's steady breathing. Finally, Pete turned back to face Jake, and the boy could see the guilt etched into every line of the old man's weathered face, the burden of knowledge he'd carried alone for too long. "Your father didn't just suspect what Henderson was doing," Pete began, his voice steady now, as if he'd made a decision to tell Jake everything, to trust him with the full weight of the truth. He knew. He spent 6 months collecting evidence, working alone because he didn't know who in the county government could be trusted, who might be on Henderson's payroll or too afraid to act. He took water samples from the streams below those old mine shafts, dozens of them, and had them tested at a private laboratory 3 counties away, paying out of his own pocket because he couldn't use official channels. The results came back showing contamination levels that were off the charts: lead, mercury, arsenic, industrial solvents, compounds that don't occur naturally and could only have come from deliberate dumping. Your father documented everything, kept meticulous records with dates and locations, and chain of custody documentation that would hold up in any court. Pete moved to a wooden chest in the corner of his cabin, opening it to reveal stacks of folders and notebooks, and pulled out a manila envelope that he handled with the reverence of someone holding something precious and dangerous. He gave me copies of some of his findings, made me promise to keep them safe in case something happened to him. I thought he was being paranoid, told him he was worrying too much, that even Henderson wouldn't dare harm a federal forest ranger. I was a fool. Pete's voice cracked, and he paused to collect himself before continuing. Your father also took photographs, hundreds of them, using a telephoto lens from concealed positions in the forest. He captured images of Henderson's trucks making midnight runs up those old logging roads, workers in hazmat suits handling barrels with chemical warning labels, waste being dumped directly into the mine shafts. He recorded license plate numbers, documented patterns of activity, built a case that was airtight and damning. He was planning to take everything to the Environmental Protection Agency and the FBI simultaneously, to bypass local authorities entirely and force a federal investigation that Henderson couldn't buy or intimidate his way out of. Pete returned to the table and sat down heavily, the envelope resting between his gnarled hands. 3 days before your father was scheduled to drive to the state capitol and deliver his evidence, he came to see me. He was worried, said he'd been followed, that his phone calls sounded strange, like someone might be listening. He asked me to keep these copies safe and to look after you and your mother if anything happened to him. I told him nothing would happen, that he was being cautious to the point of paranoia. 2 days later, he was dead. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Jake felt his chest tighten, his breathing becoming shallow as Pete described the official version of events. They said he fell from Widow's Peak while on a solo patrol, that his climbing rope frayed and broke, that it was a tragic accident, but these things happen in the mountains. The investigation was cursory, handled by the county sheriff who plays golf with Thomas Henderson every Sunday. Your father's body was found at the base of the cliff by hikers the next morning. His ranger vehicle was parked at the trailhead, his equipment scattered on the rocks below. The rope that allegedly failed was never properly tested, just visually examined and declared defective due to age and wear. The case was closed within a week, ruled accidental death, and that was that. Pete's hands trembled as he opened the envelope and pulled out several photographs, spreading them across the map. Jake leaned forward, his eyes widening as he saw images of trucks with Henderson Mining logos, men in protective gear, barrels being rolled toward dark openings in the mountainside. Your father was an expert climber, Pete said, his voice thick with emotion. He'd scaled peaks all over this range for 20 years without incident. He inspected his equipment religiously, replaced ropes and carabiners on a strict schedule, never took unnecessary risks. The idea that he would fall due to equipment failure is absurd to anyone who knew him. But I had no proof it was anything else, no evidence of foul play, just my gut telling me that your father was murdered because he threatened to expose Henderson's crimes. Pete looked at Jake with eyes that held both warning and apology. I've lived with that guilt for 18 months, knowing I should have done something, should have pushed for a real investigation, should have taken his evidence to the authorities myself. But I was afraid, Jake. I'm not proud of it, but I was afraid of what Henderson would do to me, of ending up like your father. So I kept quiet, told myself I was protecting you and your mother by not stirring up trouble, that if I left it alone, Henderson would leave your family alone. And maybe I was right. Maybe that's why you and your mama are still safe. He reached across the table and gripped Jake's shoulder with surprising strength. But now you've found your father's map, and if you found it, that means Henderson's people might know about it too. That black SUV you saw last night, that wasn't coincidence. Henderson has eyes everywhere. County employees, local police, people in town who report anything unusual in exchange for jobs or money. He's dangerous, Jake. More dangerous than you can imagine. He's already killed once to protect his operation, and he won't hesitate to do it again. Jake left Pete's cabin with the old ranger's warnings echoing in his ears. The photographs and documents now safely returned to the manila envelope that Pete insisted on keeping hidden in his wooden chest. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, and Jake knew he should head home before his mother returned from her double shift and discovered his absence. But as he walked down the trail with Rex beside him, his father's map folded in his pocket, a different plan took shape in his mind with a clarity that felt almost like destiny. The first location marked on the map wasn't far from Pete's cabin, perhaps another hour's hike into territory that Jake knew reasonably well from his explorations with his father. It was a remote canyon called Whisper Creek, named for the sound the wind made as it moved through the narrow rock formations, a place where few people ventured because the terrain was difficult and there was nothing of particular interest to casual hikers. But according to his father's map, this location held something crucial, marked with a red circle and the notation primary cache in his father's careful handwriting. Jake told himself he would just look, just see if he could find whatever his father had hidden there, that he wouldn't do anything dangerous or foolish. But even as he formed these rationalizations, he knew he was lying to himself, knew that once he started down this path there would be no turning back, that every step took him deeper into the same dangerous investigation that had cost his father his life. Rex seemed to sense Jake's determination and perhaps shared it, the German shepherd's pace quickening as they left the main trail and struck out cross-country through dense forest, following game paths and his father's taught lessons about reading the land. The terrain grew steeper, more rugged, the towering pines giving way to twisted juniper and exposed rock faces that required careful climbing. Jake's muscles burned with exertion, his hands scraped and bleeding from grabbing sharp stones for handholds, but he pushed forward with a single-minded focus that surprised him with its intensity. As they descended into Whisper Creek Canyon, the temperature dropped noticeably, the narrow walls blocking the late afternoon sun and creating shadows that seemed deeper and more ominous than they should have been. The creek itself was barely a trickle this time of year, its bed mostly exposed rock with occasional pools of stagnant water that should have been clear and fresh, but instead held an oily sheen that made Jake's stomach turn. This was evidence of the contamination Pete had described, visible proof that poison was seeping into the watershed, killing everything it touched. Rex stopped suddenly, his body going rigid, his nose working the air with the intensity of a dog detecting something important. Jake froze, listening, and heard nothing but the whisper of wind through the canyon, the distant cry of a hawk circling somewhere above. But Rex's behavior suggested they weren't alone, that someone or something else had been here recently. Jake crouched low and moved forward more cautiously now, using the canyon's natural cover to stay hidden as much as possible. Then he saw them, tire tracks in the sandy soil near the creek bed, fresh enough that the edges hadn't yet eroded, deep grooves that suggested a heavy vehicle, possibly a truck. The tracks led further into the canyon, following what must have been an old mining road now mostly reclaimed by nature but still passable for someone who knew it was there and didn't mind some rough driving. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as he realized Henderson's people had been here, perhaps were still here, searching for the same thing he was seeking. He moved forward with even greater care now, staying close to the canyon wall where shadows provided concealment. Rex pressed against his leg as if the dog understood the need for stealth. The tire tracks ended at a wider section of the canyon where the old mining road terminated in a turnaround area, and Jake could see where vehicles had recently parked, the ground disturbed by boots. Cigarette butts scattered near a flat rock that had served as an impromptu seat. But the area was empty now, whoever had been here having moved on. And Jake felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. According to his father's map, the cache should be somewhere near this exact spot, hidden but accessible to someone who knew where to look. Jake studied the canyon walls, searching for anything that matched the small sketch his father had included on the map, a distinctive rock formation that looked vaguely like a bird's head in profile. He found it after 10 minutes of careful searching, about 15 feet up the western wall, a jutting outcrop of weathered stone that, once he saw it, clearly resembled an eagle's proud profile. Below the eagle's head formation, a tumble of smaller rocks appeared natural and undisturbed, but Jake noticed something his father had trained him to see. The rocks didn't quite match the surrounding geology, their color and texture slightly different, suggesting they had been moved from elsewhere and arranged to look natural. He climbed carefully, testing each handhold, Rex whining softly below as he watched his young master scale the dangerous wall. When Jake reached the false rock pile, he began removing stones one by one, setting them aside carefully so he could replace them later. Behind the facade of rock, hollowed into the canyon wall itself, was a space just large enough to hold a metal ammunition box, the kind his father had used for storing sensitive equipment in the field. Jake's hands shook as he pulled the box free, noting its substantial weight, and carefully descended back to the canyon floor, where Rex greeted him with anxious licks to his face. Jake sat on the canyon floor with his back against the cold stone wall, the metal box resting in his lap, its weight somehow both reassuring and terrifying. His hands trembled as he worked the latches, which were stiff from exposure to mountain weather but still functional, a testament to his father's careful planning. Rex pressed close against his side, the dog's warmth and solid presence the only thing keeping Jake grounded as he prepared to open what felt like a message from beyond the grave. The latches finally gave way with a metallic click that echoed off the canyon walls, and Jake lifted the lid slowly, almost afraid of what he would find inside. The box was packed carefully, each item wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture, organized with the methodical precision that had characterized everything his father did. Jake pulled out the first bundle and unwrapped it to reveal a thick folder containing laboratory reports, each page stamped with the logo of Mountain West Environmental Testing, a facility his father must have driven hours to reach. Jake's eyes scanned the technical language, understanding enough to grasp the horrifying picture the numbers painted. Lead concentrations 50 times above safe drinking water standards, mercury levels that would cause permanent neurological damage, arsenic compounds linked to cancer, industrial solvents that should never exist in natural water sources. Each report was dated and marked with GPS coordinates that corresponded to locations on his father's map, creating an irrefutable chain of evidence documenting systematic contamination across miles of watershed. The second bundle contained photographs, dozens of them printed on high-quality photo paper that preserved every damning detail. Jake spread them across the ground, his breath catching as he saw images his father had risked everything to capture. Henderson mining trucks with visible company logos driving up remote mountain roads in the middle of the night, their headlights captured as bright streaks in long exposure shots that also showed the date and time stamped in the corner. There were photographs of men in hazmat suits, rolling barrels marked with chemical warning symbols toward the dark mouths of old mine shafts, images of waste being dumped directly into openings in the earth, close-up shots of the barrel labels that clearly identified their contents as toxic industrial waste. His father had even managed to photograph some of the perpetrators' faces, men Jake didn't recognize but whose features were clear enough that they could be identified and prosecuted. The third item in the box was a small digital voice recorder, the kind journalists used for interviews, wrapped carefully in a waterproof case. Jake's hands shook as he pressed the play button, and his father's voice filled the canyon, so clear and familiar that tears immediately blurred his vision. The recording began with his father stating the date, time, and location, then shifted to what sounded like two men having a conversation, their voices captured from some hidden vantage point where his father must have concealed himself and the recording device. Jake listened in growing horror as the men casually discussed disposal schedules, tonnage of waste being moved, payments to unnamed officials who ensured inspections were cancelled or reports were buried. One voice mentioned Henderson by name, referring to him as the boss, and discussing instructions they'd received to accelerate the dumping operation because the old ranger is asking too many questions and we need to finish and clear out before this becomes a problem. The recording continued for nearly 20 minutes, documenting multiple conversations that must have been captured over several nights of surveillance, each one adding another layer of evidence that would be devastating in any courtroom. But it was the final item in the box that broke Jake completely, that made the tears he'd been fighting finally spill down his cheeks in hot tracks that dripped onto his jacket. It was a letter, written in his father's handwriting on lined notebook paper, sealed in a plastic bag with Jake's name written across the front. With trembling fingers, Jake opened the bag and unfolded the letter, his father's words swimming before his eyes as he struggled to focus through his tears. The letter began with the words Jake would never forget, words that would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. Son, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to watch you grow into the man I know you'll become. Sorry I won't see you graduate or get married or have children of your own. But I'm not sorry for what I did, for the fight I chose, because some things are worth dying for. This mountain raised me, raised your grandfather and his father before him. It's given our family everything: clean water, clean air, beauty, and peace, and a connection to something larger than ourselves. Henderson and men like him see it as nothing more than a dumping ground, a place to hide their crimes because they think nobody cares about a remote wilderness that doesn't generate tax revenue or create jobs. But I care, and I know you do too. Jake had to stop reading, his chest heaving with sobs that he tried to muffle against his sleeve, not wanting to make noise that might carry to whoever else might be in this canyon. Rex whined and licked his face, and Jake held onto the dog's thick fur like a lifeline before forcing himself to continue reading. I've collected evidence that will destroy Henderson's operation and put him in prison where he belongs. But I know he'll try to stop me, and I know he has the resources and connections to make me disappear if I'm not careful. So I'm hiding copies of everything in multiple locations, marked on the map I've left for you. If something happens to me, if they succeed in silencing me, then you'll find these caches when you're old enough and smart enough and brave enough to know what to do with them. Finish what I started, Jake. Take this evidence to people who can't be bought, to federal authorities who are beyond Henderson's reach. Expose what he's doing and make sure it stops. Protect our mountain. Protect the water that sustains every living thing in this valley. This is your inheritance, not money or property, but a mission, a purpose that's bigger than revenge or justice. It's about ensuring that the mountains we love survive for your children and their children. The letter concluded with words that Jake would carry with him through everything that followed. Through all the danger and fear and hard choices that lay ahead, I know this is a heavy burden to place on you, and if you choose to walk away, to destroy this evidence and live a quiet, safe life, I'll understand and I'll love you just the same. But I don't think you will. You have my heart and my conscience, and I believe you'll do what's right, no matter the cost. Trust Rex to keep you safe. Trust Pete McKenzie if you need help. Trust your own courage. I love you more than words can say. Make me proud. Jake sat in the darkening canyon, his father's letter clutched in his hands, the weight of that final request settling over him like a cloak he couldn't remove. Jake carefully repacked the laboratory reports and photographs into the metal box, but kept the voice recorder and his father's letter separate, tucking them into the inner pocket of his jacket where they would stay dry and safe. He pulled out the disposable camera he'd brought from home, one of several his father had kept in a drawer for documenting trail conditions and wildlife sightings, and began photographing each piece of evidence, making sure the details were clear and legible in the fading light. The canyon had grown noticeably darker, the sun having dropped behind the western rim, and Jake worked quickly, knowing he needed to finish and get home before full darkness made the trail dangerous. Rex suddenly stiffened beside him, a low growl rumbling from deep in his chest, and Jake froze with the camera halfway to his face. Voices echoed off the canyon walls, distant but growing closer, the sound of boots crunching on gravel and men talking in low tones that suggested they didn't want to be overheard. Jake's heart hammered as he shoved the camera into his backpack and grabbed the metal box, looking frantically for a place to hide. The canyon offered limited cover, mostly open ground with scattered boulders, but about 20 feet away he spotted a narrow crevice in the rock face, a vertical crack barely wide enough for a person to squeeze into. He ran for it, Rex at his heels, and pressed himself into the cold stone embrace just as the voices grew loud enough for him to distinguish words. 2 men appeared around the bend in the canyon, both wearing dark clothes and carrying heavy flashlights that swept the ground in systematic search patterns. Jake held his breath, one hand gripping the metal box, the other wrapped around Rex's muzzle to keep the dog quiet. Through the narrow opening of his hiding place, he could see the men clearly as they approached the area where he'd been sitting moments before. One was tall and heavily built, the other shorter but equally intimidating, both moving with the confident swagger of men who weren't afraid of being caught. "Boss said the kid found something," the tall one said, his flashlight beam passing within inches of Jake's hiding spot. "Probably that map the old man drew. Henderson wants us to find whatever else is hidden up here before the boy gets to it." The shorter man kicked at loose rocks, his frustration evident. "We've been searching these canyons for 3 days. Could be anywhere. Could be nothing left to find." His companion lit a cigarette, the orange glow briefly illuminating a face that was hard and cruel. "Henderson doesn't pay us to make excuses. He pays us to solve problems. The old ranger was a problem, and we solved it. If the kid becomes a problem, we'll solve that too. Simple as that." Jake's blood turned to ice, his father's letter suddenly burning against his chest like a brand. These were the men who had murdered his father, speaking about it as casually as if they were discussing pest control, and now they were talking about killing him with the same cold indifference. The shorter man laughed, a sound without humor. "Kid's what, 12? Shouldn't be hard to arrange another tragic accident. Mountains are dangerous places." They moved on, their flashlight beams sweeping the far end of the canyon, their voices fading as they continued their search. Jake remained frozen in his hiding place, Rex trembling against him, both of them waiting until silence returned to the canyon and darkness completed its claim on the narrow space between the walls. Jake waited in the crevice until the men's voices disappeared entirely, his muscles cramped and aching from holding himself motionless for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. When he finally emerged, full darkness had claimed the canyon, and he had to navigate by moonlight and memory. Rex pressed close against his leg as they made their way back toward the trail. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves making Jake's heart leap into his throat. He clutched the metal box against his chest, his backpack heavy with the camera and evidence, and moved as quickly as he dared over the treacherous terrain. They had almost reached the main trail when a flashlight beam suddenly cut through the darkness behind them, and a shout echoed off the rocks. "There, I see movement." Jake didn't hesitate. He ran, abandoning caution for speed, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs, with Rex racing beside him. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Multiple men now, their flashlights bobbing through the trees like malevolent fireflies. Jake's lungs burned as he pushed himself harder than he'd ever run before, his only thought to get away, to protect the evidence his father had died to collect. He veered off the trail, taking a desperate shortcut down a steep ravine that he'd only traversed once before in daylight, a dangerous path that dropped nearly vertically through loose rock and scrub brush. Jake half ran, half slid down the slope, the metal box banging against his ribs, small avalanches of stone cascading beneath his feet. He could hear his pursuer closing in, the man's heavy breathing and cursing as he navigated the same treacherous descent. Then Rex made a decision that nearly stopped Jake's heart. The German shepherd suddenly reversed direction, charging back up the slope with a fierce bark that echoed through the ravine. Jake heard the man shout in alarm, heard Rex's snarling challenge, and forced himself to keep moving even as every instinct screamed at him to go back for his dog. He reached the bottom of the ravine and kept running, tears streaming down his face, until he finally collapsed behind a massive fallen pine, gasping for breath. Minutes stretched into an eternity before Jake heard the sound he'd been praying for. Rex's familiar panting as the German shepherd appeared from the darkness, limping slightly but unharmed, having led the pursuer away long enough for Jake to escape. Jake made it home well after dark, slipping through the back door of the cabin just as his mother's headlights swept up the driveway. He barely had time to hide the metal box under his bed and wash the dirt and blood from his hands before she came inside. Exhausted from her double shift and too tired to notice the fear still written across her son's face. That night, Jake lay awake listening to Rex's steady breathing from his spot on the floor, his mind racing through possibilities and dangers. He had the evidence his father had died to collect, proof that could bring down Henderson and stop the poisoning of their mountain, but getting that evidence into the right hands seemed almost as dangerous as obtaining it had been. His first thought was the county sheriff, the official authority responsible for investigating crimes and protecting citizens. But then Jake remembered an afternoon 3 weeks ago when he'd walked past the diner where his mother worked, glancing through the window to see Sheriff Morrison sitting in a booth with Thomas Henderson, the two men laughing over coffee and pie like old friends. Jake's mother had mentioned once that Morrison and Henderson went way back, that the sheriff had gotten his job partly through Henderson's political connections. Pete's warnings echoed in his mind. Henderson has people everywhere, connections that reach into every level of local government. The sheriff couldn't be trusted. Jake pulled out his father's journal, which his mother had left on the kitchen table after reading through it again, her tears staining some of the pages. He flipped through the entries carefully, looking for names his father had mentioned, people he'd considered contacting with his evidence. Near the end of the journal, Jake found what he was looking for, a reference to Sarah Mitchell, an environmental journalist from the state capital who had written articles about corporate pollution in other parts of the region. His father had noted her contact information, including an email address, and had written beside it, "Young, aggressive reporter, not afraid of powerful interests. Possible ally if local authorities prove compromised." Jake looked at the email address, committing it to memory. Sarah Mitchell was his answer, someone outside Henderson's sphere of influence, someone whose job was exposing exactly the kind of crimes his father had documented. At school tomorrow, he would use the library computer to contact her, to send her copies of the evidence and ask for her help. For the first time since finding the stone on the mountain, Jake felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could finish what his father had started without ending up dead like the men in the canyon had so casually discussed. Jake arrived at school the next morning with the metal box hidden in his backpack, the weight of it making his shoulders ache but providing a strange sense of security. He moved through his classes like a ghost, his teachers' voices meaningless noise as he waited for lunch period and his chance to use the library computer. When the bell finally rang, he headed straight for Mrs. Chen's domain, choosing the same corner computer he'd used before. His fingers trembled as he created a new email account under a fake name, then carefully typed Sarah Mitchell's address into the recipient field. He kept his message brief and urgent. "My father was Forest Ranger David Callahan. He collected evidence of illegal toxic waste dumping by Henderson Mining Company before he died. I have proof. Please help." Jake had brought his father's small scanner from home, and he worked quickly to digitize the most damning photographs and laboratory reports, his eyes constantly darting to the library entrance in case Henderson's men somehow knew what he was doing. The files uploaded slowly on the library's ancient internet connection, and Jake watched the progress bar with mounting anxiety. Finally, the email sent, disappearing into the digital void with all his hopes attached to it. He didn't expect an immediate response, figured it might take days for a busy journalist to even read his message, so when a reply appeared in his inbox less than 5 minutes later, Jake's heart nearly stopped. Sarah Mitchell's message was short and intense. "I've been investigating Henderson for 8 months. Your father contacted me 2 days before he died but was killed before we could meet. I'll drive up tomorrow. Don't talk to anyone else. Stay safe." Jake logged out and cleared the browser history, his hands shaking with a mixture of relief and renewed fear. Sarah Mitchell believed him, was coming to help, and suddenly the impossible task his father had left him seemed achievable. He practically ran home that afternoon, eager to tell his mother that help was coming, that they wouldn't have to face Henderson alone. But the moment Jake saw their cabin, he knew something was terribly wrong. The front door stood slightly ajar, and his mother's truck was parked at an odd angle, as if she'd arrived in a hurry. Jake approached cautiously, Rex growling low beside him, and pushed the door open to find the interior ransacked. Drawers hung open, their contents scattered across the floor. Couch cushions had been slashed and thrown aside. His mother sat at the kitchen table, her face pale and streaked with tears, her hands shaking as she gripped a cup of cold coffee. When she saw Jake, she stood so quickly her chair fell backward, and she pulled him into a crushing embrace. Jake's mother released him from her embrace and gripped his shoulders with trembling hands, her eyes wild with fear. "Men came here," she said, her voice cracking. "3 of them, in expensive suits, claiming they had reason to believe we possessed items that belonged to Mr. Henderson. They showed me some kind of official-looking document, said they had authority to search the premises. I tried to call the sheriff, but they took my phone. They tore the place apart while I watched. Threatened me, said that if we had anything that didn't belong to us, it would be better to cooperate now before things got difficult." She looked around at the destruction of their small home, and Jake saw her fear transform into something harder, something that reminded him of his father. When they finally left, one of them said we should think carefully about our situation, that accidents happen to people who don't cooperate with reasonable requests. Jake's mind raced. The metal box was still hidden under his bed, but how long before Henderson's men came back? He made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. "Mom, we have to leave. Tonight. We're not safe here." He told her everything then. Finding the stone, the journal entries, Pete's revelations, the evidence hidden in the canyon, his narrow escape from Henderson's men, and finally his email to Sarah Mitchell. His mother listened with growing horror, but also with strange relief, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. Within an hour, they had packed 2 bags with essential clothes, food, and the few valuables they owned. Jake retrieved the metal box from under his bed and the documents from beneath his floorboards. As darkness fell, they loaded the truck and began the drive toward Pete's cabin. They hadn't gone 5 miles when Jake noticed the headlights in the side mirror, maintaining a constant distance behind them, never closing but never falling back, the black SUV. His mother saw it too, her hands tightening on the steering wheel, her foot pressing harder on the accelerator. "Hold on," she said through gritted teeth, and suddenly veered onto a barely visible side road that Jake recognized as one of the old logging routes. The truck bounced violently over ruts and rocks, branches scraping against the doors, but his mother drove with determination born of maternal protection. The SUV followed, its powerful engine allowing it to gain ground. They burst from the forest onto the clearing where Pete's cabin stood, and the old ranger was already on his porch, a rifle in his hands. Jake's mother barely stopped the truck before he and Rex tumbled out, and Pete was moving before Jake could explain. "Inside, both of you, now," Pete commanded, and as Henderson's men emerged from the SUV, Pete fired a warning shot into the air that cracked like thunder. "This is private property, and you're trespassing. State your business, or leave." The men retreated to their vehicle, but they didn't leave, instead parking at the edge of the clearing where they could watch and wait. Pete herded Jake and his mother inside, bolting the heavy door behind them. "I've been expecting something like this," Pete said, moving to a locked cabinet and pulling out a satellite phone. "I made some calls this afternoon, contacted the State Environmental Agency and left a message with the FBI field office in Helena. Also called an old friend who works for the state police, asked him to send a patrol car up here." He looked at Jake with something like pride mixed with concern. "Your father wasn't the only one who knew how to build a case, boy." Morning came with an uneasy stillness, the black SUV still parked at the clearing's edge like a predator waiting for its moment. Jake had barely slept, lying on Pete's old couch with Rex curled at his feet, listening to his mother's quiet crying from the spare room and Pete's steady pacing as the old ranger kept watch through the night. The satellite phone had remained frustratingly silent, no callbacks from the agencies Pete had contacted, and Jake felt hope beginning to crumble under the weight of their isolation. Then, around 10 o'clock, they heard vehicles approaching, and Jake's heart sank until he saw not more black SUVs but a white news van with satellite equipment mounted on its roof, followed by a sedan. A woman emerged from the sedan, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a canvas jacket, carrying a laptop bag and a determined expression that reminded Jake of his father. Sarah Mitchell had arrived. She strode past Henderson's men without acknowledging them, knocked firmly on Pete's door, and when Jake opened it, she looked at him with an intensity that was somehow both intimidating and reassuring. "Jake Callahan?" He nodded, unable to speak. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. We have a lot of work to do and not much time." Within minutes, Pete's small cabin had transformed into a makeshift investigation headquarters. Sarah's news crew set up cameras and lighting while she spread Jake's evidence across Pete's kitchen table, her eyes widening as she examined each document and photograph. "This is extraordinary," she breathed, her fingers tracing the laboratory reports. "I've been investigating Henderson mining for 8 months, following rumors and environmental complaints, but I could never get hard evidence. Witnesses would recant, documents would disappear, nothing ever stuck. Your father documented everything perfectly." She looked at Jake with respect that made him feel simultaneously older and more vulnerable. "I need to interview you on camera. Tell me everything. How you found this evidence, what happened in the canyon, what those men outside threatened. The story needs your voice. Needs people to see a 12-year-old boy carrying on his murdered father's work." Jake glanced at his mother, who had been silent since Sarah arrived, and saw her nod slowly, her fear giving way to grim determination. For the next 2 hours, with cameras recording and Sarah asking careful questions, Jake told his story. He showed his father's journal, displayed the evidence, described the conversations he'd overheard in the canyon. Sarah documented everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood they were building not just a news story, but a legal case that would need to withstand the scrutiny of courts and powerful lawyers. The interview had just concluded when the sound of car doors slamming drew everyone's attention to the windows. Jake peered through the curtains and felt his blood run cold. The single black SUV had been joined by 3 more vehicles, and at least 8 men now stood in Pete's clearing, their body language aggressive and coordinated. The man who stepped forward was different from the others, older and wearing an expensive suit that seemed absurd in the mountain wilderness. He approached Pete's porch with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. "We know you're in there," he called out, his voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable threat. "We represent Mr. Henderson's interests, and we have reason to believe you're in possession of stolen property, documents and materials taken from company sites without authorization. Hand them over now, and we can resolve this civilly. Otherwise, we'll be forced to involve law enforcement and press charges for theft and trespassing." Pete moved to the door, his rifle visible in his hands, and spoke through the heavy wood. "The only thieves here are the men dumping poison in our watershed. You're on my property without invitation. Leave now, or I'll be the one calling the sheriff." The man's pleasant demeanor cracked. "The sheriff is a reasonable man who understands how things work in this county. I strongly suggest you reconsider your position, old man. Accidents happen to people who make poor choices." Sarah was already moving, her phone in her hand, her news crew positioning their camera at the window. "I'm going live," she said quietly, her fingers flying across her screen. Within seconds, she was broadcasting directly to her news station's social media feeds, her voice calm and professional as she narrated what was happening. "This is Sarah Mitchell reporting live from the Montana mountains, where representatives of Henderson Mining Company are currently surrounding a private residence and threatening its occupants. As you can see behind me, multiple armed men are demanding that a 12-year-old boy surrender evidence of illegal toxic waste dumping." Pete was already on his satellite phone, and Jake heard him speaking urgently to the state police dispatcher, giving their exact location and describing the situation as a home invasion in progress. The man outside seemed to realize something had shifted, pulling out his own phone and speaking in low, urgent tones. Sarah's live stream counter showed hundreds, then thousands of viewers, comments flooding in as people across the state watched the confrontation unfold in real time. The men began retreating to their vehicles, their leader's face dark with fury but recognition that they'd lost this particular battle. Within 20 minutes, the sound of sirens echoed through the mountains as state police cruisers finally arrived. 3 state police cruisers arrived first, their sirens cutting through the mountain silence, followed within the hour by 2 vehicles from the Montana Department of Environmental Quality and an unmarked sedan carrying FBI agents who had been investigating Henderson for securities fraud and had jumped at Pete's tip about environmental crimes. The clearing around Pete's cabin transformed into a command center as officers took statements and investigators examined Jake's evidence with growing amazement. Lead investigator Dr. Rachel Torres, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and 2 decades of environmental forensics experience, spread Jake's father's map across the hood of her vehicle and studied it with intense focus. "These locations," she said, looking at Jake with something approaching awe. "Your father marked 17 dump sites. If even half of them show contamination at the levels indicated in these lab reports, we're looking at one of the largest environmental crimes in state history." Jake stepped forward, his voice stronger than he felt. "I can take you to them. I know these mountains." By noon, a convoy of official vehicles was winding up old logging roads that hadn't seen regular traffic in decades. Jake riding in the lead vehicle with Dr. Torres and 2 FBI agents, Rex sitting alert in the back seat. Sarah Mitchell's news van followed, documenting everything. At the first site, Whisper Creek Canyon, where Jake had nearly been caught, investigators in protective suits descended into the area with testing equipment and cameras. Within an hour, Dr. Torres emerged with a grim expression, holding a water sample that was visibly discolored. Contamination confirmed. Lead, mercury, arsenic, industrial solvents, all at catastrophic levels. This entire creek bed is essentially toxic waste. They moved to the second location, then the third, and at each site the story repeated with horrifying consistency. Barrels dumped in old mine shafts, chemical residue on rocks, water sources poisoned beyond any safe limits. At the 7th site, they found fresh tire tracks and evidence that dumping had occurred within the past week, Henderson's operation having continued even as Jake gathered evidence against them. Dr. Torres photographed everything methodically, collecting samples, documenting the extent of contamination with the precision of someone building an airtight case. By late afternoon, they had visited 12 of the 17 marked sites, and the scope of Henderson's crimes had become undeniable. Miles of watershed poisoned, groundwater contaminated, ecosystems destroyed, and all of it hidden in remote locations where Henderson had assumed no one would ever look. As sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Dr. Torres turned to Jake with an expression of fierce determination. "Your father would be proud. This evidence will put Henderson away for the rest of his life." The arrest happened at dawn 2 days later, a coordinated operation involving FBI agents, state police, and environmental crimes investigators descending on Thomas Henderson's sprawling mansion overlooking the valley. Jake watched it unfold on the television in the safe house where he and his mother had been taken for their protection. Sarah Mitchell's live coverage showing Henderson being led out in handcuffs, his expensive suit and silver hair looking diminished against the backdrop of armed agents swarming his property. Within hours, 6 company executives were also arrested at their homes and offices, charged with conspiracy, environmental crimes, and in Henderson's case, suspected involvement in the death of Forest Ranger David Callahan. The investigation had moved with stunning speed once the evidence Jake provided gave authorities the legal foundation they needed. Search warrants executed at Henderson, mining offices revealed internal documents confirming everything Jake's father had documented, including emails discussing the dumping operation and explicit instructions to deal with the ranger who was asking questions. The story exploded across national news networks, Sarah Mitchell's reporting appearing on every major channel as journalists recognized the significance of what had been uncovered. A 12-year-old boy finishing his murdered father's investigation, evidence hidden in a stone on a mountain, corporate executives ordering toxic waste dumped into pristine wilderness, and all of it documented with irrefutable proof. Sarah's reporting was meticulous and powerful, but she made sure every story centered Jake's courage and his father's sacrifice. David Callahan gave his life trying to protect these mountains, she said in one broadcast that would later win her a National Journalism Award. His son Jake had the strength to finish what his father started, facing threats and danger that would break most adults. This is a story about corruption and environmental destruction, but it's also a story about a boy's love for his father and his determination to honor that legacy. Jake and his mother remained in protective custody for 3 weeks while investigators built their case and ensured Henderson's network of associates posed no further threat. They stayed in a small apartment in the state capital, guarded by federal marshals, and Jake watched as the story he'd lived became something larger than himself. Environmental groups hailed his father as a hero. The governor promised comprehensive watershed restoration. Congress announced hearings on corporate environmental crimes. And through it all, Jake felt a strange mixture of grief and peace, knowing his father's work had not been in vain, that the mountain they both loved would be protected and healed. As investigators continued excavating Henderson's criminal enterprise, they discovered that Jake's father had been far more thorough than anyone realized. Using the coordinates from his map and following leads in his journal, authorities found 4 additional evidence caches hidden throughout the mountains, each containing documentation of different aspects of Henderson's operation. One cache revealed financial records showing bribes paid to county officials, inspectors, and even a state legislator who had blocked environmental protection legislation. Another contained recordings of conversations between Henderson and his lawyers discussing how to intimidate witnesses and destroy evidence. The most damning cache included a detailed log maintained by Jake's father over nearly 2 years, documenting not just the dumping operation but a network of corruption that extended through multiple levels of government. Jake's father hadn't been working alone, investigators learned. He had quietly connected with other concerned citizens. A retired geology professor who had noticed strange mineral content in creek samples, a local doctor who had seen unexplained illness clusters in communities downstream from the dump sites, a county clerk who had observed environmental reports being pulled from public records, and even a Henderson mining employee whose conscience had finally overcome his fear. These individuals had been feeding information to Jake's father, helping him build a comprehensive picture of crimes that went back nearly a decade. The scope expanded beyond simple illegal dumping. Henderson had been running similar operations in 3 other states, using the same pattern of corrupting local officials and hiding waste in remote locations. His company had falsified environmental impact studies for major projects, obtained permits through fraudulent means, and systematically violated federal clean water regulations while reporting compliance. The estimated cost of environmental remediation across all affected sites climbed into hundreds of millions of dollars. Criminal charges multiplied as prosecutors from multiple jurisdictions coordinated their cases. What had begun with Jake finding a stone on a mountain had revealed a criminal conspiracy involving dozens of individuals and affecting thousands of square miles of wilderness. Sarah Mitchell's continued reporting uncovered even more connections. Interviews with former Henderson employees revealing a corporate culture where environmental crimes were standard practice and whistleblowers were threatened into silence. Federal authorities announced they were investigating whether Henderson's operation constituted organized criminal activity under RICO statutes, potentially adding decades to his prison sentence. Through it all, Jake's father emerged as the hero who had seen the full picture, who had patiently and methodically documented everything, knowing that only overwhelming evidence could overcome Henderson's power and influence. His foresight in creating multiple evidence caches and his careful cultivation of a network of allies had ensured that even his death couldn't stop the truth from emerging. The town meeting was held 6 weeks after Henderson's arrest in the high school gymnasium because the usual town hall couldn't accommodate the hundreds of people who wanted to attend. Jake sat in the front row between his mother and Pete, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, Rex lying at his feet. The room buzzed with conversation, a mixture of shame and anger and determination that Jake could feel like electricity in the air. Mayor Patricia Chen stood at the podium and called the meeting to order. Her voice trembled as she began. "We're here tonight to acknowledge a truth that many of us have avoided for too long. David Callahan tried to warn us. He brought his concerns to town meetings, filed reports, asked us to pay attention to what was happening in our mountains. And we failed him." She paused, her eyes finding Jake's mother in the crowd. "Some of us didn't believe him. Some of us were afraid of Henderson's power, afraid of losing our jobs or facing his lawyers, and David Callahan paid for our cowardice with his life." One by one, community members stood to speak. Old Man Jessup admitted he'd seen Henderson's trucks using back roads at strange hours but had said nothing. Linda Torres confessed she'd been ordered to bury environmental complaints and had complied out of fear. Even Sheriff Morrison sent a letter acknowledging he had dismissed David's concerns because Henderson was a friend and major campaign donor. Jake's mother sat rigid through these confessions. When Mary Peterson, a teacher who had taught both Jake and his father, stood and said through tears, "I'm so sorry, Ellen. We should have stood with David." Jake's mother finally broke, burying her face in her hands as the weight of all those apologies crashed over her. The town council announced the establishment of the David Callahan Environmental Protection Fund, seeded with donations from across the state and nationally. The fund would support environmental monitoring, protect whistleblowers, and ensure that what happened with Henderson could never happen again. They were also renaming the mountain wilderness area the David Callahan Memorial Wilderness. Then Mayor Chen looked directly at Jake. "Jake Callahan, would you like to say something?" Jake's throat tightened. He hadn't prepared anything. His mother squeezed his hand, and Pete nodded encouragement. Slowly, Jake stood and walked to the podium. Someone adjusted the microphone down to his height, and suddenly hundreds of faces were looking at him, waiting. "My dad loved these mountains more than anything except me and my mom." Jake began, his voice cracking, then growing stronger. "He used to tell me that we don't own the land, we're just borrowing it from future generations. And we have a responsibility to return it better than we found it." He looked out at the crowd, at people who had failed his father but were trying to make amends. "I'm not angry at you. I think my dad would understand that standing up to someone like Henderson is scary, but I also think he'd want me to say that we can't let fear stop us from doing what's right. If we see something wrong, we have to speak up, even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous." Jake's hands gripped the podium. "My dad's gone, and nothing can bring him back. But his work, what he fought for, that's still here. The evidence he collected is cleaning up the mountains. And I promise that I'll spend my life continuing what he started, protecting the places he loved, making sure his sacrifice meant something." The gymnasium erupted in applause, people rising to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to shake the walls. The federal courthouse in Helena was an imposing building of granite and glass, designed to inspire respect for the law and fear in those who broke it. Jake walked through the metal detectors with his mother and Pete flanking him, Rex wearing an official emotional support animal vest, feeling the weight of marble columns and high ceilings pressing down on him. The prosecution team had spent weeks preparing Jake for this moment, warning him that Henderson's lawyers would try every trick to discredit his testimony. Lead prosecutor Margaret Santos had been honest with Jake. "You're 12 years old, which makes you both the prosecution's strongest asset and most vulnerable witness. Henderson's defense will try to paint you as a confused child manipulated by adults. You need to stay calm, tell the truth, and remember that the evidence speaks for itself." The courtroom was packed with journalists, environmental advocates, and curious citizens. Thomas Henderson sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression one of patient suffering. His legal team consisted of 6 lawyers from a prestigious firm. When Jake was called to the witness stand, the courtroom fell silent. He placed his hand on the Bible, his voice steady as he swore to tell the truth, then took his seat with Rex lying at his feet. Prosecutor Santos began with gentle questions, establishing Jake's background, his relationship with his father. Jake answered clearly, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. Then they reached the heart of his testimony, finding the stone. Jake described that morning on the ridge trail with Rex, the strange markings, the instinct that told him something important lay hidden inside. He explained his careful work, opening it, finding the leather pouch, discovering his father's journal and the map. The courtroom watched, riveted, as this 12-year-old boy calmly described piecing together his father's investigation. Henderson's lead attorney, Marcus Blackwell, approached the witness stand with a predatory smile. "Jake, isn't it true that you were angry at Mr. Henderson before you ever found this alleged stone?" His tone was condescending. "No, sir," Jake replied. "I didn't know who Mr. Place Henderson was until I read my father's journal." Blackwell shifted tactics. "Your father died in what was ruled an accident. Isn't it possible you've convinced yourself there was some conspiracy because accepting accidents is too painful?" Jake felt anger flare but remembered Santos's coaching. "The men in the canyon talked about killing my father. I heard them on the recordings. That's not me convincing myself of anything. That's evidence." The lawyer tried several more approaches, suggesting Jake had been coached, that the evidence had been planted, but Jake remained steady, his answers consistent. When Blackwell asked sarcastically, "So you expect this court to believe that a 12-year-old boy solved a criminal conspiracy that allegedly eluded authorities for years?" Jake's response silenced the courtroom. "I didn't solve anything, sir. My father did. He collected the evidence, documented the crimes, and hid it where he knew I'd find it. I just had the courage to finish what he started, which is apparently more than the adults who were supposed to protect us could manage." The jury deliberated for 3 days, and when they returned to the courtroom, their faces told the story before the verdict was read. Jake sat with his mother and Pete in the gallery, Rex at his feet, as the forewoman stood and announced guilty verdicts on all 37 counts: illegal disposal of hazardous waste, conspiracy to commit environmental crimes, bribery of public officials, obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and most significantly, conspiracy to commit murder in connection with David Callahan's death. Henderson's face remained impassive as the verdicts were read, but Jake saw his hands clench, white-knuckled on the defense table. The sentencing hearing came 2 weeks later, and Judge Patricia Morrison, who had replaced the compromised local officials, showed no mercy. "Mr. Henderson, you poisoned an entire region's water supply for profit. You corrupted public officials sworn to protect citizens. You silenced a good man who tried to stop you, leaving a widow and a fatherless child. Your crimes have caused immeasurable harm to the environment and the community." She sentenced him to 45 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for a man in his 60s. The 6 company executives received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. Beyond criminal penalties, the civil judgments were staggering. Henderson Mining Company was ordered to fund a complete environmental remediation effort estimated at $370 million. The company would be liquidated, its assets sold to pay for the cleanup and compensate affected communities. Teams of environmental engineers would spend the next decade removing contaminated soil, treating poisoned water sources, sealing the old mine shafts properly, and monitoring the watershed's recovery. Dr. Torres, who would oversee the cleanup, explained to Jake during a site visit that healing would be slow but certain. "The mountain is resilient. With the dumping stopped and active remediation underway, we'll see improvements within months. Full recovery will take years, maybe decades in some areas, but your father's work ensured this process could begin." Standing on the ridge where he'd found the stone, Jake watched crews working in Whisper Creek Canyon below, removing barrels and contaminated soil. The scars on the land were visible, but so was the promise of healing. Sarah Mitchell's reporting had sparked similar investigations in 2 other states where Henderson operated, leading to additional arrests and cleanup efforts. The David Callahan case had become a landmark in environmental law, cited in congressional hearings, and used as a model for prosecution of corporate environmental crimes nationwide. Spring had returned to the mountains, bringing renewal that Jake recognized in melting snow revealing new growth, in streams running clear and cold, in life reasserting itself after dormant months. Jake stood on the ridge trail where everything had begun 9 months ago, the same spot where Rex had first pawed at the earth and revealed the stone that changed their lives forever. His mother stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, and for the first time since his father's death, Jake saw peace in her eyes. The memorial plaque had been installed the previous week, mounted on a large boulder where hikers could rest and look out over the vast wilderness below. The bronze plate bore his father's name and words Jake had helped compose. "David Callahan gave his life protecting these mountains. His courage reminds us that one person willing to stand for what's right can change the world." Rex sat at attention beside the plaque, his amber eyes scanning the ridgeline, and Jake thought about how the dog had known, had sensed something important hidden that day, had led Jake to his destiny as his father had planned. The cleanup efforts were visible from this vantage point, crews working in valleys that had been poisoned, streams being restored to health, the mountain slowly healing. Dr. Torres had reported that water quality tests showed improvement, that fish were returning to streams that had been dead. It would take years for complete recovery, but the process had begun. Jake's life had changed profoundly. Schools invited him to speak about environmental protection. Sarah Mitchell had written a best-selling book about the case. But more than public recognition, Jake had found purpose. He understood why his father had been willing to risk everything, why some causes were worth dying for. His mother squeezed his shoulder. "He'd be so proud of you, not just for finishing his work, but for the man you're becoming." Jake leaned against her, understanding they had survived something that could have destroyed them. "I think he knew," Jake said. "I think he knew that if something happened to him, I'd be the one to find the stone. That's why he hid it where Rex and I would discover it. He was passing the mission to me, trusting that I'd be ready when the time came." Pete joined them on the ridge, his face weathered but eyes still sharp. "Your father and I used to stand right here and talk about the future. He wanted to make sure these mountains would still be wild and clean and full of life." A hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off canyon walls. Life was returning to the mountains, resilient and determined. Jake would finish school, study environmental science or law. dedicate himself to the work his father started. But for now, he was content to stand here with his mother and Pete and Rex, to watch the sun paint the peaks in gold and rose, to feel clean wind on his face and know he had honored his father's legacy. Jake touched the memorial plaque, his fingers tracing his father's name, and whispered words only the mountain could hear. "I finished it, Dad. The mountain is safe. I promise I'll keep it that way."